Between 1710 and 1759, Britain shipped roughly 26 million pounds of solid silver out of the country and into China, and got almost nothing back except tea. That was the problem. Not a war, not a rebellion, an accounting problem. Britain had become addicted to Chinese tea, and China would accept only one form of payment for it, silver. Hard silver by the ton, sailing east and never coming home. Every cup poured in London was a small withdrawal from the national treasury, and the balance was running one direction only. By the early 1800s, the drain had become a strategic emergency. A nation that keeps shipping its silver away and receiving only a consumable leaf in return is a nation slowly bleeding the metal that backs its money. London needed to reverse the flow. It needed to find something, anything, that the Chinese would buy in the same vast quantities that Britain bought tea. It found one product, a product the Chinese government had already banned, a product that created its own demand, because the customer, once bought, could not stop buying. What followed was not a normal war. There were battles and warships and a humiliating treaty at the end of it, but the objective was never territory in the ordinary sense. The objective was the balance sheet. The weapon was addiction, and the goal was to take a crippling trade deficit and turn it, by force, into a surplus. This is the documented story of how the British Empire engineered the addiction of millions of Chinese people as a deliberate instrument of monetary policy. The first time a great power weaponized mass addiction to fix its own balance of payments and then sent its navy to protect the profits when. The victim tried to stop it. This is not the war they teach as a clash of civilizations. It is the war that was fought, start to finish, over a column of figures. Before we follow the silver, this channel traces the money the history books leave out. The trade balances, the cartels, and the financial machinery behind the events you thought you understood. If that's the history you want, subscribe and stay with it. The numbers in this one are darker than the battles. To understand the war, you have to understand the deficit, because the deficit is the entire reason the war happened. In the 18th century, China was the largest economy on earth, and it ran a commanding trade surplus with the West. Europe wanted what China produced, tea above all, but also silk, porcelain, and fine manufactured goods. China, for its part, wanted almost nothing Europe made. The Qing economy was self-sufficient and enormous. European woolens and trinkets held no appeal in a market that already produced finer goods of its own. That left European merchants with a single way to pay, silver. China operated on a silver-based monetary system, and silver was the one foreign import the Chinese market would absorb without limit. So the silver flowed east in staggering quantities, decade after decade. And the terms of that trade were dictated entirely by China, which sharpened the imbalance further. Under what the West called the Canton System, foreign merchants were confined to a single port, Canton, and could deal only through a licensed guild of Chinese merchants, the Kohong, who set the terms. Westerners could not travel inland, could not deal directly with the wider Chinese market, and had no diplomatic standing whatsoever. China regarded them as supplicants, not equals. For a British merchant, this meant the most profitable trade on earth was conducted on a leash held entirely by the other side. Britain could not negotiate better terms, could not open new markets, and could not slow the silver drain by any means available to it under the rules as they stood. The only variable Britain controlled was what it brought to sell, and so the entire pressure of the crisis bore down on a single question: what could be sold into China in enough volume to turn the flow around? The British appetite made it worse than anyone else's. A reduction in the British tea duty in 784, cutting the tax from over 100% down to around 10%, sent domestic tea consumption surging. The more affordable tea became in London, the more silver had to sail to Canton to pay for it. Britain was on the gold standard. It did not mine its own silver in any meaningful quantity, which meant it had to first buy silver from continental Europe and then ship that silver to China. The empire was paying twice, once to acquire the metal, and again in the strategic cost of watching it disappear over the horizon. For a mercantilist age, this was close to a national catastrophe. The prevailing economic doctrine held that a nation's strength was measured by the bullion in its vaults, and that a sustained trade deficit was a sustained transfer of national power to a rival. Members of Parliament and pamphleteers openly described the China tea trade as a drain on the wealth of the nation. The mathematics were unforgiving. As long as Britain bought tea and China bought nothing, the silver would keep flowing one way until it ran out. The institution caught in the middle of this was the East India Company, the chartered corporation that held the British monopoly on trade with the East. The company was the sole legal importer of Chinese tea into Britain, and the tea trade was its most lucrative business. But every chest of tea it brought home had to be paid for in silver. It was hemorrhaging at the Canton end. The company's most profitable trade was simultaneously its deepest financial wound, so the company went looking for a product, not a better woolen, not a cheaper clock. It needed a commodity that the Chinese market would consume in quantities large enough to reverse a flow measured in millions of pounds of silver. It needed something that, once a customer began buying, the customer could not, stop. It already controlled exactly such a product. It grew in the fields of Bengal. In 1773, the East India Company secured a monopoly on opium production in Bengal, and in 1793 it tightened its grip on the entire supply chain. This was the turn on which the whole story pivots, the moment a trade deficit met a narcotic. Opium solved the silver problem with a brutal elegance that no ordinary export could match. A bale of cotton or a case of clocks sells once, to a customer who may never buy again. Opium sells forever, to a customer who must buy again, because the product manufactures its own demand inside the body of the buyer. From a purely financial standpoint, ignoring every human consequence, it was the perfect commodity, self-renewing, inelastic, and consumed by a market of unlimited size. There was one obstacle. The Chinese government had banned opium, first in 1729, again in 1796, because it could see exactly what the drug was doing to its population. Selling it into China was illegal. The company's answer to this was a piece of financial engineering as cynical as anything in commercial history. It would not sell the opium in China itself. That would expose the company directly to the charge of smuggling contraband into a sovereign nation. Instead, the company grew the opium in Bengal, auctioned it in Calcutta to nominally independent private merchants, and collected its money there, on Indian soil, with clean hands. What those private traders, the country traders, then did with the opium was officially none of the company's concern. What they did was smuggle it into China on an industrial scale. By 1797, the company was already auctioning around 4,000 chests of opium a year, each chest weighing roughly 170 pounds, to the private smugglers who ran it up the Chinese coast. The structure gave the company everything it wanted, the profit of the opium trade without the legal stain of being the smuggler. It was a laundering operation conducted at the scale of an empire. Follow the money through that structure, and the cold genius of it becomes clear. The company sold the opium in Calcutta for silver, booking its profit cleanly on Indian soil, and that silver flowed back to settle the very T-bills that had started the crisis. The private trader who bought the chest at auction then carried the risk of the illegal run into China, and was rewarded with the enormous margins that illegality commanded. At the Chinese end, the smuggler sold the opium for Chinese silver, which then had to be carried back out of the country to complete the loop. It was a closed financial circuit, and at every stage of it a British interest took its cut. The Bengal grower under monopoly, the company at the Calcutta auction, the trading house running the coast, and the Crown collecting tea duties at the far end of the chain. The drug was not merely a product, it was a pump, a machine engineered to draw silver out of China and route it, stage by stage, into the British system. At the sharp end of the trade stood the trading houses, and the greatest of them carried two names that still exist in the corporate world today, Jardine, Matheson and Company. William Jardine and James Matheson built the largest opium agency in Canton, and through the 1830s they ran the smuggling network that turned the company's Bengal harvest into Chinese silver. They did not work alone. Their largest supplier of opium out of India was a Bombay merchant named Janzetji Jejihoy, who shipped the drug to Jardine in vast consignments and grew immensely wealthy doing it. This was a fully integrated supply chain, grown under a state monopoly, financed through a chain of merchant houses, and delivered into the veins of a banned market. And the numbers moved exactly as London needed them to. Before the trade took hold, silver poured into China. By the 1830s, the direction had reversed. In that decade, against an imperial decree forbidding it, the silver hemorrhaged out of China. By one accounting, more than $26 million in silver coin and a further $25 million in specie flowing out, against barely $7 million flowing in. The deficit Britain had suffered for a century was not merely closed, it was inverted. China was now the one bleeding silver, and the bleeding was the entire point. Hold on to that reversal, because in a moment it stops being a story about ledgers and becomes a story about people. We are about to count the human cost of the surplus. How many millions had to be addicted to keep the silver flowing the right way, and then watch what happened when one Chinese official decided to destroy the inventory of the most powerful drug network on earth. That single act of destruction came with a price tag that Britain would later send a fleet to collect. A balance of payments does not get reversed for free. The price of Britain's new surplus was paid in Chinese bodies, and the scale of it is the part the financial framing usually hides. The drug spread the way the company's accountants needed it, to relentlessly and upward through society. What began among the idle rich worked its way down and out until, in the coastal regions where the smugglers landed their cargo, opium use had reached a staggering share of the adult male population. Estimates of the number of addicts vary wildly because the trade was illegal and uncounted. The Qing commissioner who would soon confront it estimated around 4 million of his countrymen were addicted. A British physician practicing in Canton put the figure as high as 12 million. Whichever number is closer, the meaning is the same. An entire society was being hollowed out, one customer at a time, to keep a trade balance pointed in Britain's favor. The damage was not only personal, it was economic, and it compounded the very silver drain it had created. As addiction spread through the coastal economy, business activity slowed, the civil service decayed, and productivity fell across whole regions. China was now losing twice, losing its silver to pay for the drug, and losing the economic capacity of the millions the drug consumed. The surplus Britain enjoyed was, on the other side of the ledger, a nation being dismantled. The Qing government was not blind to this. It could see its silver draining away and its population deteriorating, and in 1839 the emperor sent a hardline official named Lin Zexu to Canton with orders to end the trade for good. Lin was not corruptible, which made him dangerous. He moved directly against the foreign merchants, demanding they surrender every chest of opium in their possession. Then he did something that turned a smuggling crackdown into a financial casus belli. In 1839, Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed the foreign opium stockpile, more than 20,000 chests of it. The destroyed inventory was worth, by the valuations of the time, roughly £2.5 million sterling. In today's terms, that is an enormous sum, and it belonged, on paper, to British merchants, the Jardines and Mathesons and their suppliers. This is the hinge of the entire war, and it is a financial hinge, not a moral one. Britain did not go to war because its honor was wounded. It went to war because a sovereign government had destroyed several £1 million worth of British-owned property and threatened the single trade that had reversed the empire's silver crisis. The merchants whose contraband had been seized did exactly what you would expect. They demanded their government make them whole. The superintendent of trade on the ground, Charles Elliot, had effectively guaranteed the merchants compensation for their surrendered opium, which quietly transferred a private smuggling loss onto the British government's books and gave London a direct financial stake in forcing China to pay. A drug debt had just become a matter of state. What happened next is the part that earns this video its title, because it was, in the most literal sense, a war fought to protect a trade balance. And it was a war that the drug merchants themselves designed. When Lin Zexu destroyed the opium, William Jardine, the most powerful opium trader in Canton, sailed for London to lobby the government directly. In late 1839, he put before Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston a document history remembers as the Jardine Paper, a detailed war plan, complete with strategic maps, the number of troops and warships required, the ports to be forced open, the demand that China be made to pay for the destroyed opium, and the proposal that Britain seize an island base off the Chinese coast. A private narcotics dealer had handed the British government a blueprint for a war, and Palmerston followed it closely. The British strategy in the conflict that followed mirrored Jardine's memorandum in its essentials. This is the detail that strips away every other explanation. The war was not conceived by statesmen reluctantly defending national honor. It was drafted by the drug syndicate whose inventory had been seized and adopted almost wholesale by the state. In 1840, a British fleet arrived off the Chinese coast. The composition of that fleet tells you everything about the nature of the war. Among the warships and transports were vessels leased from Jardine, Matheson and Company itself, the very opium firm whose seized cargo had triggered the conflict. The drug syndicate was not merely the cause of the war, it was a contractor to it, renting its ships to the Navy that came to defend its trade. There is no cleaner illustration of a state and a cartel fused into a single financial interest. The military contest was hopelessly one-sided. British steam-powered warships and modern artillery faced Chinese forces equipped with antiquated guns. The fleet bombarded forts, seized cities along the coast and the river approaches, and methodically dismantled China's ability to resist. This was not a war China could win. It was a war designed to extract a settlement. And the settlement, when it came, was written in the language of finance from beginning to end. In 1842, aboard a British warship anchored in the Yangtze, Qing officials signed the Treaty of Nanjing at gunpoint. Read its terms as the financial instrument it was, and the true objective of the war becomes unmistakable. China was forced to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. Break that figure down, because the breakdown is a confession. $12 million was to reimburse Britain for the cost of the war itself. The victim was made to pay the expenses of its own conquest. $6 million was direct compensation for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed. China was forced to pay, in full, for the illegal narcotics it had confiscated on its own soil, and $3 million covered debts that Chinese merchants owed to British traders. The whole sum was to be paid in installments over 3 years, and any payment that ran late would accrue interest of 5%. The defeated nation was put on a payment plan, with interest, to settle the bill for being attacked over a drug it had tried to ban. Then came the asset seizure. China ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity, a deep-water harbor that would become the permanent commercial base for British trade in East Asia, a foothold the empire would hold for over a century and a half. 5 ports were forced open to British merchants, dismantling the old system that had confined foreign trade to a single supervised port. China lost the power to set its own tariffs, and a most favored nation clause ensured that any concession China was ever forced to grant another foreign power would extend automatically to Britain as well. Every clause served the balance sheet. The indemnity refilled the treasury. The ceded port secured the trade route. The forced open markets guaranteed future flow. The tariff clause stripped China of the power to ever financially defend itself again. This was not a peace treaty in any ordinary sense. It was a creditor's foreclosure imposed by naval gunfire on a sovereign nation to protect and expand the most profitable narcotics operation in history. And it worked. The silver flowed Britain's way. The trade was secured. The deficit that had haunted London for a century was buried under the wreckage of the Qing economy. So who actually walked away with the money, and what did the addiction surplus ultimately cost? Not just China, but the shape of the modern world. In a moment we settle the final accounts, the fortunes that were built on the trade and still exist today. The Second War, Britain fought when the first surplus wasn't enough, and the single reason this qualifies as the first true financial war in modern history. The reckoning is where the real price is tallied. Tally what the arrangement produced on every side of the ledger. For Britain, the war achieved precisely its financial objective. The century-long silver drain was reversed and then locked in by treaty. The tea kept flowing west, now paid for out of the proceeds of a drug trade the empire had forced China to tolerate. Hong Kong became one of the most valuable commercial possessions on earth. And the principle established at Nanjing that Britain could open a foreign market by force and bill the victim for the privilege became the template for a century of unequal treaties. For the men who ran the trade, the fortunes were vast and they endured. Jardine, Matheson and Company, the firm that smuggled the opium and leased ships to the war that protected it, did not vanish into history. It survives today as a major Asian conglomerate. The Bombay supplier Jamsetji Jejapoi was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1842, the first Indian so honored, and made a baronet in 1858. His name still marks hospitals and schools. The families who bought land in early Hong Kong and the proceeds of the trade, the Sassoons, the Keswicks, the Kadoris, built dynastic wealth that persists into the present. The profits of the addiction surplus were not a one-time windfall. They compounded for generations. For China, the price was a catastrophe measured in decades. The indemnity drained the treasury. The forced open ports flooded the country with foreign goods that undercut domestic producers. The loss of tariff control stripped the government of the tool every nation uses to defend its own economy. And the addiction itself continued, because the war had not been fought to end the drug trade, but to protect it. The proof of that came less than 2 decades later. The Treaty of Nanjing had opened the ports and refilled the British treasury, but it had not actually legalized opium. The trade remained technically illegal even as it boomed under the protection of British guns. For Britain, an illegal trade was a trade that could still, in principle, be challenged. So when China resisted further concessions, Britain manufactured a second war. From 1857, alongside France, it fought the Second Opium War, bombarded Canton, marched on Peking, and burned the emperor's summer palace to the ground. The settlement that followed, the treaties of Tianjin, finally did what the First War had stopped short of. It formally legalized the opium trade. The 2 wars together complete the logic. The first secured the markets and the silver. The second made the drug itself legal, removing the last obstacle to the surplus. At no point in either war was the objective to reduce the addiction. The objective was always to protect the revenue the addiction produced. Chinese historians do not call this an era of trade disputes. They call it the beginning of the century of humiliation, and it began with a balance of payments problem solved by narcotics. And here is why this stands as the first true financial war of the modern age. Wars have always been expensive, and trade has always been a motive for conflict. But the opium wars were something new and specific. The deliberate weaponization of mass addiction as an instrument of monetary policy, followed by the use of military force purely to defend a trade balance. The objective was never glory or territory for its own sake. The objective, from the first chest of Bengal opium to the last clause of the Treaty of Nanjing, was the ledger, to take a deficit that was draining the empire's silver and to convert it, by addiction and then by gunfire, into a surplus. Lay the logic down in a line, and it is chillingly simple. Britain could not afford its tea, so it manufactured a demand it could control, in a product the customer could not refuse. And when the customer's government tried to stop the bleeding, Britain sent a fleet to make sure the bleeding continued. The story you were taught frames the opium wars as a clash over trade rights and national pride. The numbers frame it differently, as a balance sheet rescued by addiction and enforced by warships. The first time an empire went to war not for land or faith, but to keep a column of figures pointed in its favor. That is not the war they teach in the classroom. It is the war that was won in the accounts long before it was ever fought on the water. If this is the kind of history you were never taught, the version written in trade balances and indemnities instead of dates and battles, then subscribe, because every video on this channel follows the money the same way. There is a financial story behind almost every war you think you understand. We'll trace the next one together.